Hey everyone, Saylor here, up at beautiful Mount Storm Park in Clifton. I'm gonna find a spot to settle in for a second after I show you the view. Most of you are familiar with this park, some of you might not be. Off of Lafayette, against Mount Storm. And we're gonna go ahead and dive into chapter 1 of our book study. Okay, we're starting with chapter 1 here. I spent much of my childhood listening to the sound of striving. It came in the form of bad music, or at least amateur music, coming up through the floorboards of my bedroom, the plink, plink, plink of students sitting downstairs at my great Aunt Robbie's piano, slowly and imperfectly learning their scales. My family lived in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago in a tidy brick bungalow that belonged to Robbie and her husband Terry. My parents rented an apartment on the second floor while Robbie and Terry lived on the first. Robbie was my mother's aunt and had been generous to her over many years, but to me she was kind of a terror. Prim and serious, she directed the choir at a local church and was also our community's resident piano teacher. She wore sensible heels and kept a pair of reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had a sly smile but didn't appreciate sarcasm the way my mother did. I'd sometimes hear her chewing out her students for not having practiced enough, or chewing out their parents for delivering them late to a lesson. "Good night," she'd exclaim in the middle of the day, with the same blast of exasperation someone else might say, "Oh, for God's sake." Few, it seemed, could live up to Robbie's standards. The sound of people trying, however, became the soundtrack to our life. There was plinking in the afternoons, plinking in the evenings. Ladies from church sometimes came over to practice hymns, belting their piety through our walls. Under Robbie's rules, kids who took piano lessons were allowed to work on only one song at a time. From my room, I'd listen to them attempting, note by uncertain note, to win her approval, graduating from Hot Cross Buns to Brahms' Lullaby, but only after many tries. The music was never annoying, it was just persistent. It crept up the stairwell that separated our space from Robbie's. It drifted through open windows in the summertime, accompanying my thoughts as I played with my Barbies or built little kingdoms made out of bricks. The only respite came when my father got home from an early shift at the city's water treatment plant and put the Cubs game on TV, boosting the volume just enough to blot it all out. This was the tail end of the 1960s on the south side of Chicago. The Cubs weren't bad, but they weren't great either. I'd sit on my dad's lap in his recliner and listen to him narrate how the Cubs were in the middle of a late season swoon, or why Billy Williams, who lived just around the corner from us on Constance Avenue, had such a sweet swing from the left side of the plate. Outside the ballparks, America was in the midst of a massive and uncertain shift. The Kennedys were dead. Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed standing on a balcony in Memphis. The 1968 Democratic National Convention turned bloody as police went after Vietnam War protesters with batons and tear gas in Grant Park, about 9 miles north of where we lived. The killing of Dr. King had set off riots across the country, including Chicago. White families, meanwhile, were moving out of the city in droves, lured by the suburbs, the promise of better schools, more space, and probably more whiteness too. None of this really registered with me. I was just a kid, a girl with Barbies and blocks, with 2 parents and an older brother who slept each night with his head about 3 feet from mine. My family was my world, the center of everything. My mother taught me how to read early, walking me to the public library, sitting with me as I sounded out words on the page. My father went to work every day dressed in the blue uniform of a city laborer, but at night he showed us what it meant to love jazz and art. As a boy, he had taken classes at the Art Institute of Chicago, and in high school, he had painted and sculpted. He had been a competitive swimmer and boxer in school too, and as an adult was a fan of every televised sport, from professional golf to the NHL. He appreciated seeing strong people excel. When my brother Craig got interested in basketball, my father propped coins above the doorframe in our kitchen, encouraging him to leap for them. Everything that mattered was within a 5-block radius. my grandparents and cousins, the church on the corner where we were not quite regulars at Sunday school, the gas station where my mother sometimes sent me to pick up a pack of Newports, and the liquor store, which also sold Wonder Bread, penny candy, and gallons of milk. On hot summer nights, Craig and I dozed off to the sound of cheers from the adult league softball games going on at the nearby public park, where by day we climbed on the playground jungle gym and played tag with other kids. Craig and I are not quite 2 years apart in age. He's got my father's soft eyes and optimistic spirit, my mother's implacability. The two of us have always been tight, in part thanks to an unwavering and somewhat inexplicable allegiance he seemed to feel for his baby sister right from the start. There's an early family photograph, a black and white of the four of us sitting on a couch, my mother smiling as she holds me in her lap, my father appearing serious and proud with Craig perched on his. We're dressed for church or maybe a wedding. I'm about 8 months old, a pudge-faced, no-nonsense bruiser in diapers and an ironclad white dress, looking ready to slide out of my mother's clutches, staring at the camera as if I might eat it. Next to me is Craig, gentlemanly in his little bow tie and suit jacket, bearing an earnest expression. He's 2 years old and already the portrait of brotherly vigilance and responsibility, his arm extended towards mine, his fingers wrapped protectively around my fat wrist. At the time the photo was taken, we were living across the hall from my father's parents in Parkway Gardens, an affordable housing project on the south side made up of modernist apartment buildings. It had been built in the 1950s and was designed as a co-op, meant to ease the post-World War II housing shortage for black working-class families. Later, it would deteriorate under the grind of poverty and gang violence, becoming one of the city's more dangerous places to live. Long before this, though, when I was still a toddler, my parents, who had met as teenagers and married in their 20s, accepted an offer to move a few miles south to Robbie and Terry's place in a nicer neighborhood. On Euclid Avenue, we were two households living under one not very big roof. Judging from the layout, the second floor space had probably been designed as an in-law apartment meant for 1 or 2 people, but 4 of us found a way to fit inside. My parents slept in the lone bedroom, while Craig and I shared a bigger area that I assume was intended to be the living room. Later, as we grew, my grandfather, Purnell Shields, my mother's father, who was an enthusiastic if not deeply skilled carpenter, brought over some cheap wooden paneling and built a makeshift partition to divide the room into 2 semi-private spaces. He added a plastic accordion door to each space and created a little common play area in the front where we could keep our toys and books. I loved my room. It was just big enough for a twin bed and a narrow desk. I kept all my stuffed animals on the bed, sorting them around my head each night as a form of ritual comfort. On his side of the wall, Craig lived a sort of mirror existence with his own bed pushed up against the paneling, parallel to mine. The partition between us was so flimsy that we could talk and lay in bed at night, often tossing a sock back and forth through a 10-inch gap between the partition and the ceiling as we did. Aunt Robbie, meanwhile, kept her part of the house like a mausoleum, furniture swathed in protective plastic that felt cold and sticky on my bare legs when I dared sit on it. Her shelves were loaded with porcelain figurines we weren't allowed to touch. I'd let my hand hover over a set of sweet-faced glass poodles, a delicate-looking mother and 3 tiny puppies, and then pull it back, fearing Robbie's wrath. When lessons weren't happening, the first floor was deadly silent. The television was never on, the radio never played. I'm not even sure if the 2 of them talked much down there. Robbie's husband's full name was William Victor Terry, but for some reason we only called him by his last name. Terry was like a shadow, a distinguished-looking man who wore 3-piece suits every day of the week and pretty much never said a word. I came to think of upstairs and downstairs as 2 different universes, ruled over by competing sensibilities. Upstairs, we were noisy and unapologetically so. Craig and I threw balls and chased each other around the apartment. We sprayed Pledge furniture polish on the wood floor of the hallway so we could slide farther and faster in our socks, often crashing into the walls. We held brother-sister boxing matches in the kitchen, using the 2 sets of gloves my dad had given us for Christmas, along with personalized instructions on how to land a proper jab. At night, as a family, we played board games, told stories and jokes, and cranked Jackson 5 records on the stereo. When it got to be too much for Robbie down below, she'd emphatically flick the light switch on in our shared hallway, which also controlled the light bulb in our upstairs hall, off and on again and again, her polite-ish way of telling us to pipe down. Robbie and Terry were older. They grew up in a different era with different concerns. They had seen things our parents hadn't, things that Craig and I, in our raunchous childishness, could never begin to guess. This was some version of what my mother would say if we got too wound up about the grouchiness downstairs. Even if we didn't know the context, we were instructed to remember that context existed. Everyone on earth, they tell us, was carrying around an unseen history, and that alone deserves some tolerance. I think it's a good place for us to stop off. The book will come along slowly, and we'll add our discussions and prompts onto Schoology as we need to. But what did we just read? We're seeing the very beginnings of Michelle Obama's extraordinary life, coming from very humble working class background in Chicago, Illinois, living in a room that her parents are renting from an older aunt and uncle. And we see that family is important to her even then at such a young age. So I look forward to continuing this journey with you on this book and learning more about a really amazing American.